We're putting some pretty sophisticated suspension pieces in this car. We want it to not only be comfortable to drive on the street, but we also want the owner to be able to take it to a road course or an autocross track and have some fun with it. It's got the Trick Detroit Speed front suspension and their rear quadrillink in it, big brakes, big wheels and tires, some Corvette pieces in there, rack and pinion steering. So all of these parts will make this car corner flat and stick to the track. But the only thing that needs some help now is the chassis itself. And a Camaro is a unibody, so you have the body tub and then the front subframe that attaches to it. And we've installed the Detroit Speed subframe connectors that tie the front rails through the body to the rear frame rails, but there's still some room for improvement. So we're now going to install a Chassisworks G Street roll cage in this car to help control any body movement and twisting from the body shell itself. Now there's a lot of considerations if you're going to plan a roll bar install into your car. The first thing you want to do is figure out what you're going to do with the car, and if you're going to race it in a particular sanctioning body like NHRA drag racing or SCCA sports car racing, they have rule books that tell you how the cage has to be installed and what type of material it needs to be and even how it's welded. So before you do anything, if you're going to race the car, check that first so that you don't have to, modify the cage afterwards to fit the rule book. Now in this case, this car is not going to see any professional competition racing, but we wanted to make sure we had a good quality cage. And the Chassisworks G Street Exact Fit series was appealing because it's designed for the '69 Camaro, and it comes pre-bent. It's all mandrel bent tubing. It's 1 3/4 inch diameter, 134 thousandths wall thickness, mild steel tubing. And they make another version that has a slightly smaller wall thickness that is SCCA compliant if you want to race in that series. But in our case, we wanted this primarily to stiffen the chassis. And to me, the term roll cage, when you say roll bar, I always envision the Shelby Cobra that has the hoop over the driver with the one support, which was designed to keep the driver's head from getting crushed if the car flipped upside down or rolled over. In this case, we're not worried so much about the car rolling over, although the cage does provide safety. We want this thing to stiffen the chassis up to make sure that nothing is twisting, so we get the most out of our trick suspension. The cage install on the Loose Change Camaro was done at a time during the build process where the car was already stripped and disassembled and mounted on a chassis jig. This is a little different if you have a running driving car because you have to take out pretty much all the interior, carpeting, dash pad, the rear seat, the rear package tray, all that stuff has to come out in order to properly install a cage. And you also have to consider, if you have an empty car, that you plan the cage design around things like armrests and door panels and the headliner. You have to leave enough room around these things so that when you put those pieces back in, they still fit. Because a lot of times people put the cage too close to something and then you've got a problem. Planning ahead is also crucial in installing a roll cage because it's not wise to just take the tubes out of the box, put it in the car and start welding them up. Because as the cage is being built inside the car, you start to lose clearance around the tubes. And you have to figure out how you're going to weld all the way around them. And there's a lot of considerations like that. In our case, the first step was to mount the floor plates to the rocker panels. The rockers on a Camaro are structural, they're very strong. It's a great foundation to mount the cage. So the kit came with 2 plates to attach the roll cage on each side, one at the back of the rocker and one at the front of the rocker panel. And once we got those in place, we put in the main hoop, which is the bar that goes right behind the driver and passenger from the floor up over the top and then back down to the other side. We modified our roll cage a little bit, mostly for aesthetic reasons. We wanted to hide it as much as possible. So we leaned the main hoop backwards just a little bit. So when you look at the car from the side and the windows are up, the trim would conceal the tube. And if the windows are down, it almost looks like, just that regular piece of trim there. It doesn't really stand out too much. Once we found a position we liked, we started the installation of the forward-facing bars. And these go from the rear hoop across the roof of the car and then down through the dashboard to the base of the car again. So we had to cut a couple of holes in the dashboard to feed these things through. And then we got those two bars tacked in place. Again, trying to push them outward as far as we could so that you couldn't see them so much, but also to leave room for the interior trim panels. There was a design on this cage that we changed just a little bit. Those top tubes would angle down and attach to the main hoop if you took them right out of the box. We didn't want that angle, again, to conceal those tubes, so we cut them and added some straight sections so that way they disappeared completely when you looked at the side profile of the car. There's some specialty tools that you will need to install a roll cage. One is a tube notcher. We got this from HTP. It bolts to the bench or a drill press and allows you to use included hole saw adapters to cut circular notches in the end of your tubes to weld them together. Another thing that's very handy is some angle finders. Of course, maybe a chop saw or a band saw to cut the tubes. And you need a good welder. You can MIG weld these together. Some sanctioning bodies, like the NHRA, specifies if you have a chrome moly cage, you need to TIG weld that. This one was mild steel, but we decided to TIG weld it anyway, and we used our HTP Invertig to do all that work.